the honor here. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who is recognized as one of the leading authorities on the history of revolutionary Boston. Robert Allison is professor of history at Suffolk University, and he also teaches history at the Harvard Extension School. And during his long teaching career, he has received several distinguished teaching awards. Bob is president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, a life trustee of the USS Constitution Museum, and chairman of Revolution 250, the consortium of organizations that have already begun commemorating the 250th anniversary of the events of the American Revolution. Today, as Kim has explained, marks the beginning of Lincoln's 250th anniversary events, which will continue through the next couple of years. And Lincoln has special significance in the events 250 years ago. Remember that Lincoln's Minutemen and militia companies, approximately 110 strong, were the first companies to arrive in Concord in response to Paul Revere's alarm. And the revolution did not begin in Lexington or Concord, as those towns would have everyone believe. But actually in Lincoln, where the fighting erupted and reached the point of no return along what we now call Battle Road. Bob has written extensively about revolutionary Boston, the Boston Tea Party. He wrote a short history of Boston and also the Boston Massacre. He has edited a number of books on American history spanning from the colonial period to the 20th century. And in addition, he has spoken all around Boston, indeed in a number of conferences in different parts of the world. So we are very fortunate to have him here with us this afternoon to share his knowledge about the events that turned Massachusetts citizens against their mother country. And he'll offer an interesting perspective that the revolution here in America was something very different from our usual sense of revolution as a radical rebellion and change. So without further ado, I am honored to present Professor Bob Allison.
Thank you so much, Rick, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon to kick off Revolution 250 here in Lexington. And John Adams said that the American Revolution was accomplished before a drop of blood was spilled at Lexington Green. You know, accomplished, finished. He meant it was a revolution that happened in the minds of the people of Massachusetts, a revolution in thinking about how they would be governed and who would govern. So that's really the story, as I'm thinking about the American Revolution, something that was happening long before. And we can see in the year 1774, the year in which we're now in the 250th anniversary, all of this beginning, all of this really happening. What had been a decade of resistance to various policies of the British Parliament really coming to fruition, and a big change happening here in 1774, which we then can see breaking out into bloodshed the following year. If I may. So, the year 1773, as you know, ends with the destruction of the tea in Boston Harbor, great signal event. And this, by the way, what you see on the left is the Almanac from 1773. Paul Revere did the cover for the Almanac, showing Governor Thomas Hutchinson. It's actually the rather mild-mannered man you see on the right, as the wicked statesman in the hour of his death, with death standing over him, Satan holding up a list of crimes as Governor Hutchinson is about to be ushered into the jaws of hell. It's not a subtle message about how Hutchinson had gone wrong here. And this is really showing a turning on Governor Hutchinson, mild-mannered. I have a whole lecture lecture about what a good guy Thomas Hutchinson was, but I won't give it to you today. The Tea Party, the destruction of the tea. We had a tremendous reenactment last December. 20,000 people came to Boston to participate in this event. The things that are happening in 1774 are less susceptible to reenactment, to great public displays. And actually one of the burning issues in early 1774 was about something I think would be almost impossible to reenact. It's a political debate about who should pay judges in Massachusetts. After the events of 1770, and I apologize for now going backward in time, a riot in Boston, 8 British soldiers and their captain put on trial for murder, and the deaths of 5 Bostonians were part of a mob who were attacking British soldiers. The soldiers had very good defense from among the leading patriots. Josiah Quincy, whose nickname in the family actually was the Patriot, and John Adams stepped forward to defend these soldiers, Adams saying that counsel is the last thing a man in a free country should want when he is on trial for his life, defended the most hated people in Boston after Governor Hutchinson, and won the acquittal of all but 2 who were convicted of manslaughter, branded on the thumbs, and sent to New Jersey, which is probably more than anyone deserved. Wow. Parliament realized they had dodged something. What happens the next time a Crown official gets in trouble with one of these provinces and winds up on trial for his life? And they don't have Josiah Quincy and John Adams stepping forward to defend him. So the Parliament passed an act, or the Crown decided that it would henceforward pay the judges in Massachusetts £200 a year as a way of keeping them less susceptible to pressure from the mob or the populace. Now immediately, when the Parliament said, we will pay the judges in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Assembly responded by saying that violates the Massachusetts Charter of 1691. It's the Assembly that pays the judges. The judges are answerable to us, not to the Parliament. And it's really this act that sets in motion a series of events that are going to turn things. And here you see the judges in Massachusetts, some of the premier judges in Massachusetts, who will respond to the Assembly by saying, we will not accept the Crown's salary. We agree this violates the Constitution. Every judge in Massachusetts agrees to this but one. And that one is, I apologize for this, the one judge who just responds by saying he will accept the salary is Peter Oliver. There he is. Thank you. Peter Oliver is not only the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court, he's the brother-in-law of Governor Thomas Hutchinson. And he's an iron manufacturer. He has an iron foundry in the town of Taunton. And being a judge is not the glamorous. Are there any judges here? It's not the glamorous occupation you may imagine. He's traveling around the province, hearing cases, usually in dirty courthouses or taverns, having to share often not only a room but a bed with a counsel who also travel with him in this traveling judicial show, going from county court to county court. Anyone who has legal business knows the court will be on session on the Wednesday the 15th, so everyone shows up and then they decide who will represent whom, and then the judge presides over all of this and then makes their decisions and then goes on to the next town. He says it takes actually more away from his business to do this than he's getting from the Crown's salary. So if the Crown wants to give him an additional £200, he is not going to turn it down. Now, as I said, the Assembly has already said that violates our charter. And what do you do when a judge is does something which violates the charter? And in the Massachusetts Assembly, new Representative John Adams says the Assembly could impeach him. Now, the other members of the Assembly had not thought this through as carefully as Adams had. They recognized, okay, first, the Assembly has never impeached the Crown official before. there was a happy time when I would have to explain to audiences what impeachment is, but we've been bombarded with examples in the last few years. So impeachment involves the House of Representatives drawing up a bill of impeachment, and then an upper body hears the case. And in this case, the upper body would be the governor's council. Presiding over the governor's council, of course, is the governor, Thomas Hutchinson, who is Judge Oliver's brother-in-law. Secretary to the province, also seated at the governor's council, is Andrew Oliver, the brother of Peter Oliver, the judge. So the members of the assembly say, first, we've never impeached anyone. Second, when it gets to the governor's council, Hutchinson will simply say, you can't impeach the crown official, and that will be the end of it. And Adams, ever persistent, says, we still have to try. We still have to do it. And they do. And predictably, the matter goes to the governor's council, and Governor Hutchinson says, you can't impeach crown officials. That's the end of it. And we'll come back to this story in a bit. We have turned, though, the public against Judge Oliver in such a way that in March of 1774, when his brother, Andrew, dies, Judge Oliver is told he should not go to the funeral. It's going to be in Boston. His safety could not be guaranteed in March of 1774 if he attends the funeral of his brother. And it's amazing to think that just the previous March, Andrew Oliver's wife had died, and her death was such a big public thing that as the public recognized his mourning, that Phyllis Wheatley wrote a poem about the death of Peter Oliver's wife. Astonishing that the following year, when his brother dies, he can't go to the funeral because the public has turned so much against him. So this is really what's happening in early 1774 in Massachusetts. You have an argument over the paying of judges, which becomes a great cause for people who want to attack the judiciary, attack one judicial official. The other big thing happening, of course, is Parliament is responding to the destruction of the tea. And a couple of things are going on. First, Don Hafner reminded me earlier that in December of 1773, when the town of Lincoln had a town meeting about the tea arrival, and there was a vote in town meeting, should we support stronger steps of non-importation, that is more resistance to the British Crown. Of 120 members of the town meeting in Lexington, 51 voted yes. That is, fewer than half said yes. The situation calls for us to take more steps. Towns like Lincoln were not hotbeds of resistance the way Boston was. And the thinking in London, as well as in Governor Hutchinson's rooms, was that the real crisis is in Boston. You have a group of hotheads here, incendiaries like Samuel Adams, Josiah Quincy, John Adams, who will do anything to bring Hutchinson down. Most people in the province want to remain simply doing what they do, being left alone, going about their business. And all of this is changing in 1774. And one of the big changes begins in 1774 when Parliament passes the Boston Port Bill, shutting down the port of Boston until Boston pays back the East India Company for the tea that the Bostonians had destroyed in December of 1773. So Boston is shut off. Nothing can go in or out of Boston. And Josiah Quincy responds with a pamphlet, Observations on the Boston Port Bill, which doesn't simply argue, boy, this is really a bad thing for us, because now all of our trade is cut off. And what's going to happen to us now that we can't buy stuff or ship stuff, and we have to pay off the East India Company? It doesn't make those arguments. Instead, it makes the argument that the Boston Port Bill can only be enforced with military power. And so this is going to be the military usurping civil power. He also points out that the East India Company had not asked Parliament to bail them out. Well, they had asked Parliament to bail them out the previous year, but they had not asked Parliament to get Boston to pay them back. So how come Parliament is now not doing the bidding of a private corporation, but acting in that corporation's interest without the corporation asking? And finally, he points out, two other things he points out. One, the Port Act punishes the innocent along with the guilty. You know, we don't know who the 180 people were who went and destroyed the tea. Most of them probably were not from Boston. But now all Bostonians are going to suffer because of that. And finally, the Boston Port Bill, it's an intrusion of the military into civil affairs, and it is going to usurp the role of the town meeting in governing Boston. According to the Massachusetts Charter, again, a town can only appropriate money for particular town expenses. That is, necessary expenses in the town. Parliament is now demanding that the town get money for other purposes at an unknown at the whim of Parliament. And this takes the power of self-government out of the hands of the people of Boston and instead puts it into the hands of Parliament. Such a persuasive argument about the intrusion of Parliament into the affairs of the town of Boston. Here's a British cartoon showing Boston being made to swallow the bitter draft. And you can see all kinds of salacious things happening in this cartoon with a member of Parliament looking up America's dress and other things happening. I probably shouldn't have shown you this. I know this is a genteel crowd here in Lincoln. And the distresses of the town of Boston are felt in other places. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses, and the thinking generally is Virginia is the largest of the North American colonies, the wealthiest, and not a hotbed of sedition the way Boston is. But the Virginia House of Burgesses in May of 1774 debate what we can do to come to the aid of Bostonians. The governor of Virginia is so upset with this proposal that the Virginia House of Burgesses might come to the aid of Bostonians, he suspends the assembly. And the assembly goes across the street to a tavern to continue meeting. They call for county conventions, and at the county convention in Fairfax County, George Washington presides. George Mason, his neighbor, two of the wealthiest men in the county, write the Fairfax County Resolves, calling on Virginia to unite with Massachusetts in opposing the intrusion of Parliament into the colonial affairs. So you're beginning to see here the beginnings of colonial or provincial resistance to the British Crown, bringing together the more conservative, thoughtful Virginians with the incendiary Puritans of Massachusetts. So it's something, a change happening in 1774, and the Virginians also called for a Continental Congress to hash all of this out. And in May of 1774, the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly is meeting. They're meeting in Salem. Remember, the capital's not been moved out of Boston, and the Provincial Assembly chooses delegates to the Continental Congress, which will meet in September of 1774 in Philadelphia. While they are meeting, General Gage, the governor, sends the secretary of the province to suspend the assembly. And they know he's coming, so they lock the door. And he nails the announcement of their suspension to the door, but of course they can't see it since they're already inside. So the assembly is suspended, but not before they choose delegates to a Continental Congress. The next step in this is Parliament passes the Massachusetts Government Act. And this is an act, it's a great name for an act for the better government of Massachusetts. It suspends the assembly, it suspends the old charter of 1691. And under the old charter, people in the town meetings chose delegates to the assembly for a one-year term. The assembly then chose members of the governor's council to advise the governor. The governor could veto appointments, but he could not appoint people to the council. Now the governing body in Massachusetts will be a council chosen by the governor. a mandamus council it was called, because they served by order of the governor. Not for a one-year term, but for as long as the governor wanted them to serve. Towns could no longer have town meetings. Well, they could, but they could only have one town meeting a year. The governor, the parliament realized that in the towns of Massachusetts, the town meeting happened whenever 10 of the men in town said, let's have a town meeting. And one Massachusetts governor said even 10 of the meanest sort can call for a town meeting. By meanest, he didn't mean the nastiest, but the poorest. And then whatever that group decided was the law in the town, whether you showed up at the meeting or not. We're going to rein that in. You can have one town meeting a year. You have to ask the governor's permission, and you have to tell him what is going to be on the agenda. So the Massachusetts Government Act takes the power of directing your town affairs out of the hands of the people in the town, and instead gives it to the governor. The town meetings essentially will have no power. Essentially, remembering, town meetings at this time chose all of the officials in the town, as well as in the county. Sheriffs, tax collectors, magistrates, clerks, inspectors of roads, inspectors of trees, hogreaves, other town officials, all chosen by the town meeting. Now they will all be chosen by the governor. So the Massachusetts Government Act is really what turns towns like Lexington, Lincoln, Bedford, Concord, which had previously been not really caring what those radicals in Boston are doing, into siding with them. So after the Massachusetts Government Act, when the town meeting in Lincoln meets to discuss how they should respond to this, remember in December, 51 had said, yes, we should actually resist these British tax policies. 87 in June of 1774 said, yes, we have to resist this intrusion into our affairs. It's really a change. The Lincoln town meeting, as had other towns, had appointed a committee of correspondence to correspond with the folks from other towns in Massachusetts, as well as with the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which in many ways was a central organizing point for the resistance. And these are two of the three members of the Committee of Correspondence from Lexington, and I'm sure some of you can identify them immediately. It's amazing to think these were chosen by the town meeting. Yes? Eleazar Brooks is one, yes.
Which one?
And the one in the middle is Deacon Samuel Farrar. We don't have a picture, someone here probably has a picture of Major Pierce, who was the other member of this triumvirate who would represent the town of Lincoln. So what we see happening in the town of Massachusetts, towns like Lincoln, is resistance to these British policies, as well as then calls for people who had had the bad sense to agree to be a governor's counselor to resign. And one of the first big actions happens out in Worcester. Timothy Payne, the gentleman whose profile you see, was one of the leading citizens of Worcester. And this is his home in Worcester, it still stands. He finds his home surrounded, and it's not an angry mob, it is the Worcester County militia that surrounds his house. He's actually an officer in the militia. And then coming to call on him is the commander of the militia, Timothy Bigelow. And Timothy Bigelow, someone that Payne knew, comes in and tells him, you have to resign as a counselor. By the way, it had been very difficult for General Gage to find people who wanted to serve as governor's counselors. A lot of men say, no, I'm not interested. And here is Timothy Payne, who actually agrees to serve, then finds several hundred, if not thousand, of his neighbors surrounding the house, demanding his resignation. And Colonel Bigelow comes in to tell him, you have to resign. And so Mr. Payne, recognizing reality, does resign, and Bigelow goes outside to say, he's resigned. And then militia says, we need to hear him do it. So Bigelow goes back inside and asks Payne to write a letter of resignation. And then Bigelow goes outside to read it. Think of this, 5,000 people gathered outside, and here Mr. Payne is not a man with a projection system like I have. They can't all hear him, and they say, we can't hear you. So he tries to read it louder, and then they say, what you have to do is stand in the middle of the road and keep reading it till we've all marched past and each of us can hear you read it.
Stop.
So Payne spends the rest of the afternoon standing in the middle of the road while the militia marches past him, listening to him over and over again read his resignation. It's not simply a resignation, this is a public humiliation of one of Worcester's leading citizens. I suppose the final humiliation is this. As I said, the Payne house still stands. No longer in the Payne family, he winds up leaving. It's now actually the headquarters for the Colonel Timothy Bigelow chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution. And we have similar events happening in other parts of Massachusetts. This is yet another governor's counselor who resigns, another governor's counselor who resigns. This is the summer of 1774, as the counselors are being pressured to resign their positions because we don't think that the governor's council appointed by the governor is constitutional. And then the real trouble begins in early September. Now, General Gage had not been sent to start a war. He had been sent to keep Massachusetts allied with the British Crown, part of the empire, and prevent the resistance from turning into outright war. And one of the steps you would take if you want to prevent war is prevent the other side from getting their hands on weapons. And he knows that every town has a collection of powder for their militia. Every county has militia, has powder houses like this one in Middlesex County, not far from the Mystic River. And so General Gage wants to get the powder out of this powder house that he says actually belongs to the province, not to the local militia. And the first step, of course, is asking the general in charge of the Middlesex County militia, General William Brattle, to go to the powder house and get the powder out. General Brattle realizes that wouldn't be a good idea for him to go and get the powder out and turn it over to General Gage. So instead, he gives to General Gage's emissary the set of keys to the powder house. And the next day, this could be one reason why Brattle's house is still standing in Cambridge. The next day, General Gage sends troops out to the powder house. They get the powder, they put it onto a boat, take it down the Mystic River, down Boston Harbor, put it at Castle Island for safekeeping and to keep it out of the hands of the Middlesex County militia. Rumor spreads through Middlesex County that not only had Gage and his forces seized our powder, but in doing so, they had met with spirited resistance from the Middlesex County militia, and in resisting, a number of the militiamen were killed. That hadn't happened. But the next day, the Middlesex County militia does gather on Cambridge Common, and their aim is to go into Boston and get the powder back. This would have been, well, a disaster on many levels. Also living in Cambridge at this time was the new lieutenant governor, Thomas Oliver, no relation to the other Olivers. And it's unclear how he became lieutenant governor. In fact, it was unclear to him how he became lieutenant governor. Gage probably saw his last name and thought maybe he's related to the other Olivers, and so he's quite surprised in the middle of August when he gets the word he's been appointed lieutenant governor. Now, I don't know how many of you would react if suddenly you learned you were appointed lieutenant governor, but he realizes it would be important to fill this. There may be a lieutenant governor here, and we wouldn't know it, but Oliver is the lieutenant governor, and he doesn't want his neighbors marching into Boston trying to seize gunpowder because he knows what will happen. So he goes into Boston to meet with General Gage. when initially he had said to these guys gathered on the Cambridge Common, don't go in, they said, well, what happens if Gage sends another military force out to attack us? So one thing Oliver gets General Gage to agree to is not to send the army out to Cambridge. So Oliver goes back to say, Gage is not going to send troops to attack you. Why don't you disband? And while he was gone, though, on this mission, which averts a crisis, these guys hanging around in Cambridge do some other things. Nearby was a Judge Lee, who lived in Cambridge, and he had been appointed to the council. They surround his house and ask him to resign as counselor, and he does. And then they go to the homes of other prominent Cantabrigians who had agreed to serve as counselors. And then coming through town is Timothy Ruggles. Ruggles had been Speaker of the Massachusetts House back in the 1760s. He had presided at the Stamp Act Congress. If you're thinking about respected members of the Massachusetts body politic, Timothy Ruggles would be near the top. But that's not good enough. He happens to be coming through Cambridge that afternoon. The mob sees him, the mob of the militia sees him, and demands that he resign as a counselor and apologize for having been on the wrong side. So Ruggles feels the wrath of the Middlesex County militia as he's making his way through Cambridge. And then, much to the delight of the militia, a man named Benjamin Hallowell comes through town. Hallowell was one of the customs commissioners who had been sent back in 1767. And he is an arrogant, self-important, now I'm realizing I may be describing myself, official. He's actually riding in a carriage that has his coat of arms on the side. And he has liveried footmen. Footmen literally run alongside the carriage in their uniforms. I don't know how many of you have liveried footmen following you or announcing your presence. And Hallowell, as I said, pretentious, self-important, he thinks the thing to do when you have this big collection of the Middlesex County militia haranguing you is to get out and harangue them back. And he does. And that proves to be a mistake. In fact, his coachman starts driving off. And Hallowell manages to commandeer a horse, and he rides off after the coach, followed by the militia, who follow him across the Charles River into what's called Little Cambridge, is today Alston, and then through Roxbury to the gates of Boston at the Neck, gets through just in time, just ahead of the Cambridge militia. So what has happening here is the isolation of these people in Boston. Now, meanwhile, our friend Lieutenant Governor Oliver has returned, and it's now not good enough that he's gone in and negotiated a peace with General Gage. We want him to resign as Lieutenant Governor. This is his home in Cambridge, which I understand is now the home of the presidents of Harvard, because Oliver finds he has to resign and also leave town. You have also the Vassal home in Cambridge. The Vassal family from Antigua had built this wonderful summer house in Cambridge, and other Vassals are living along Brattle Street, which is now known as Tory Row. And they have relations in other places, including here in Lincoln. Dr. Charles Russell, who is a town doctor here in Lincoln, is related by marriage to the Vassals. And this is his home at the Codman House here in Lincoln. And a day or two after this event in Cambridge, one of the Vassals, Henry Vassal, who's a teenager, he might have been studying medicine with Dr. Russell, is riding through Lincoln in a carriage. Someone fires shots at his carriage. Now, a couple of days later, the Committee of Correspondence from Lincoln investigates, and they say, no one fired shots. People would have heard it. We have evidence that shots were fired, other evidence that shots weren't fired, but for the Dr. Russell and for Henry Vassal, even Lincoln has become too inhospitable for them to stay. So this is what's happening here in towns like Lincoln. in the aftermath of the Powder House riot in September of 1774. And all of this is leading up to General Gage had called for the Provincial Congress to meet in Salem in early October of 1774. Under the Massachusetts Government Act, the capital was supposed to move out of Boston, so Gage is going to convene the government in Salem in the first week of October. Then he had second thoughts about this. In fact, he was supposed to convene the governor's council in Salem, but most members of the governor's council, well, I should say, the members of the governor's council who had agreed to serve, and there are only about a dozen, he was supposed to appoint 36. He could only, first he gets about 24 men to agree, and then about half of those resign. The others say, well, we will meet, but we don't think it would be safe for us to meet outside of Boston. And the good thing about Boston now is General Gage is there with several thousand British troops who can protect us. So Gage is recognizing that power is slipping away from General Gage, who had come with a commission from the Crown, and slipping into the hands of committees of correspondence and town governments, county governments, even though Gage had said town governments can't meet. And as we know in Massachusetts, there really isn't such a thing as a county government. But with the suspension of the town meetings, people in the town, particularly members of the Committee of Correspondence, are calling for county conventions to meet. As power now is being taken by other people, but sometimes it's the same people. Sometimes they are the same people who had held power under the old dispensation. And we see in the fall of 1774 attacks on courts. That is, the courts are also going to meet in September of 1774. This is the Worcester County Courthouse, and this is a call for the men of Worcester County to go to the court to prevent it from meeting, because the judges, even if they're not accepting a salary, will have to be part of the new British laws which are governing the administration of justice. This is actually the list of the men who went from different towns. Sutton sent 500 men to Worcester. I was talking about this with Senator Ryan Fatman, who's from Sutton, and he said, I don't believe there are 500 men in Sutton today. But in 1774, they could send 500 men to Worcester to close down the court. And on Cape Cod, here, the presiding judge was James Otis Sr. His son is known to us as the firebrand of the 1760s. His daughter, Mercy Otis Warren, was writing these incendiary tracts attacking all Crown officials. And Judge Otis presides at the town meeting in Barnstable and also presides over the court. The courts, and as he lives not far from the courthouse. That morning, he sees the militia marching past to go surround the courthouse. And when he gets there, he is met by Nathaniel Freeman, the gentleman on the left, who is from Sandwich. And Judge Otis tells Freeman and the militia that it is my duty to tell you to disperse. And Freeman says, you have done your duty, Your Honor, now we will do ours. And they prevent the court from meeting. In Plymouth, the courthouse actually had been built by Peter Oliver, the fellow I mentioned, seemed like an hour ago, who started causing all the trouble by accepting the salary. He had built the courthouse back in the 1740s. Not only is the court shut down, but the townspeople in Plymouth go down to the harbor and try to get the Plymouth Rock out of the harbor to haul it up in front of the courthouse. They're tying in what they are doing with the Pilgrims back in 1620. In doing this, the rock splits, so they get the top half up to the courthouse, and there it sits for another 100 years until the time of the centennial of all of these events, it's restored to the rest of Plymouth Rock. In the town of Taunton, not only do they oppose what's happening, they come up with a flag to explain what they're doing. And one member of the congregation wearing a shirt that carries this image of liberty and union, the two things we are vying for, with the Union Jack in the corner. That is, we've not yet separated from the empire, we still hold out hope that the Crown will recognize that our assembly stands in relationship to us the way Parliament stands in relationship to the people of England, and we don't want Parliament governing us. We will be happy under the Crown. That at least is some of the official thinking here. Others are taking this a step further. This is our friend Timothy Bigelow, and this is what the folks in Worcester are saying about how we've devolved into a state of nature. We're no longer under the old charter because it's been suspended, but we're under something new. This is really a radical idea. And what's happened next is this. As I said, General Gage had called for the Assembly to convene up in Salem in early October, and then he thinks better of that idea. So he announces, no, the Assembly won't be meeting after all. The members of the Assembly show up in Salem anyway. They claim they hadn't gotten the word from the governor. So they wait, and the governor never shows up. Governors typically come to open a session of the Assembly, but there's no sign of General Gage. So the Assembly says, the governor hasn't shown up, so we are now meeting not as the Assembly, but as a provincial Congress, and we declare that the office of governor is vacant. And they realize, continuing to meet in Salem, while General Gage is now living, I believe, in Danvers, which is nearby, they say, we will reconvene in Concord. So they go to Concord, to the first meeting house, where the provincial Congress continues to meet. And the members of the provincial Congress are pretty much the old members of the Assembly. But there are towns which have not been represented in the Assembly, which still do send delegates. Sometimes there simply the Board of Selectmen from the town goes. And sometimes, as in the case of Lincoln, they're members of the Committee of Correspondence, who go to Concord to represent the town in the provincial Congress, this new order which is emerging with the governor's office having been declared vacant. Of course, General Gage doesn't realize the office of governor is vacant. He still is pretending that he governs Massachusetts and trying to prevent Massachusetts from slipping into outright revolution. And these are two of the three members from Lincoln of the provincial Congress. By the way, if you really want to know more about these events, I encourage you to read Don Hafner's books. Two of them are available back here, as well as Rick Wiggins's Embattled Farmers. Every town should have historians like these who are telling the town's story to the rest of us as well as the citizens of the town. Now, meanwhile, there is still hope that perhaps we can avert a crisis. And in late September, Josiah Quincy, the gentleman you see on the left, sails for England, to go to England to meet with Benjamin Franklin, who's been in London now for about 10 years, representing the Massachusetts Assembly, as well as the Pennsylvania Assembly, the Georgia Assembly, the New Jersey Assembly, as their lobbyists. The fall of 1774, there are going to be elections to Parliament. And so we sometimes forget that Britain had a parliamentary system, and there is a party in power which is very much supporting stronger policies against the Americans. After the destruction of the tea, there's thinking, we've really put up with enough from these people. Now we need to clamp down. Hence the Boston Port Bill, the Massachusetts Government Act, and other measures to bring Massachusetts into line with British policy. There's some fear that these are going to provoke a war against the Americans. And actually, two of the gentlemen who were elected to Parliament on a platform of let's avoid a war with America are Lord George Cornwallis and William Howe. Both Howe and Cornwallis will wind up as generals serving in the American cause, but they believe a war with America would be a mistake. And Quincy and Franklin are trying to work with other folks in the British opposition who want to avert a calamitous war in North America. And Quincy and Franklin both recognize how devastating that war would be, not only for the Americans, but for the British Empire. And Quincy manages to meet with a number of influential Britons who are not part of the opposition, such as the Prime Minister. He spends 2 hours with the Prime Minister. And Quincy says it was difficult since both Quincy and Prime Minister Lord North are politicians who like to talk. So how either one of them got a word in edgewise is a mystery. North was probably the better politician because he talked more, and also left Quincy convinced that North was all on the side of the Americans and hoped that we could avert any kind of calamity. And then Quincy met with Lord Dartmouth. Dartmouth was the British Secretary of State for North American Affairs. And sitting on Dartmouth's desk was a copy of Quincy's observations on the Boston Port Bill. Both North and Dartmouth had read this. They understood Quincy's arguments. They disagreed with him, but they made it seem as though, yes, we all want to avert a crisis. I believe they sincerely did. Now, Quincy said he left North and Dartmouth thinking that all was resolved, or at least we could work things out. But in the meantime, Thomas Hutchinson had also met with North and Dartmouth. And according to Quincy's memory, Hutchinson had said, don't listen to anything that incendiary says. And Quincy also attends the opening of Parliament in late December of 1774. The king, in his procession, walked so close to Quincy that Quincy felt he could touch him. Quincy also said he was really taken with the ceremony, the pageantry of the British court. John Laurens is the fellow you see in the middle, and Laurens, from South Carolina, wrote home that when the king mentioned dangerous people who are inflaming the minds of his loyal subjects against him, that is, the minds of his Majesty's subjects against him, Laurens said he felt that the king was actually pointing to Josiah Quincy there in the audience. Then there's a debate in the Parliament over, Parliament then will respond to the king's speech. And as the Parliament is debating this, one member of Parliament, the Earl of Hillsborough, actually, former Secretary of State for North American Affairs, says that there are actually men walking the streets of London today who actually should be in Newgate. And Lord Chatham, the former William Pitt, asks Lord Hillsborough who he means should be in Newgate, and Lord Hillsborough says, I mean Benjamin Franklin and Josiah Quincy. So Quincy and Franklin had gone to London, been in London, hoping to avert a crisis. It's becoming clear a crisis can't be averted. And at about the same time this is happening, word reaches New England that the king has called for weapons to be taken out of the hands of potentially rebellious subjects. And word of this reaches Newport, Rhode Island on December the 8th. The Rhode Island Assembly happens to be in session, and they take the precaution of going down to the fort in the harbor, taking all of the weapons out so that they won't fall into the hands of the British who are coming to get them, to prevent them from falling into the hands of rebellious Americans. 2 days later, a British warship arrives. It had been actually posted in New London, and while the ship is in Newport trying to find the weapons, which had already been sequestered, folks in New London go down to their fort and get the weapons out so that the Rose won't be able to seize their munitions. What you see happening over the winter of 1774 and 1775 is various British officials trying to take weapons out of the hands of these potentially rebellious subjects, and the potentially rebellious subjects actually preempting them. Similar thing happens in early December in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at Fort William and Mary. Here, Paul Revere gets word to them that the General Gage has sent troops to get the weapons out of Fort William and Mary, so the town militia is able to sequester them. So we're trying to avert a war. One way of averting a war is by preventing the weapons from falling into the hands of the enemy, although we don't claim they are an enemy, and the enemy is actually getting the weapons first. Meanwhile, back in London, Quincy and Franklin recognize the British opposition does not win the elections in 1774. And someone said actually trying to do anything with the British opposition would be like trying to put out a fire with a wet dishcloth. They weren't a very effective bunch. But meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin is at a meeting at one of his clubs, and a fellow comes up to him and says, there's a lady who would like to play chess with you. Now, Franklin liked to play chess. He's in the Chess Hall of Fame. He wrote a book about chess. In fact, the first book printed in Russia about chess carries Franklin's essay on the morals of chess. And he also liked ladies, but Franklin pays no attention to this invitation. The next week, back at the club, same fellow says, there's a lady who would really like to play chess with you. Here is her address. And the lady turns out to be Catherine Howe, whose brothers are William Howe, soon to be the Commander-in-Chief of British military forces in North America, and her other brother is Sir William Howe, Lord William Howe, who is an admiral in charge of the British fleet, which is being sent to North America. And the reason for Franklin playing chess with Catherine Howe is a pretext for talking to the Howe brothers about how we can avert a war. This is in December of 1774, and the Howes and Franklin hope that war can be averted, although I suspect at this moment they realize it could not. So thank you.
We have time for some questions, and I'm going to take the opportunity to ask one to lead off, and that is, what is your theory about why the Brits were so inept politically, why they didn't sense what was coming down the pipe and figure out how to dance around politically other than just using brute force?
Well, that's a good question. The short answer is, I don't really know, but that never stops me from pontificating. I think one thing they recognized, if we allow the Americans to govern themselves, what will happen in big parts of England where people don't have power of self-government? In fact, during the Revolution, when things start going badly for the British, one of the members of the British opposition says that, that your war in America, of course in Parliament you address the Prime Minister, will bring down your rotten system here. One thing that surprises Quincy when he gets to England, he had heard that people in England were furious about the destruction of the tea and about the Americans pushing for self-government and other things. He discovers something much different when he arrives in England. People in England, that is not Lord North and Lord Dartmouth, but people, ordinary people in England, say America's cause is the cause of liberty. If liberty fails in America, it will fail here. So it's not that the British government was inept, although in some ways they may have been, but it's that they see what will happen if they concede to the Americans. That means, the Parliament didn't represent all of the people of England the way we think of representation. Here in the American colony, in the town of Lincoln would send representatives to the general court. Every year you would elect someone. And that person, according to you, is there to do what you want that person to do. That's not the way Parliament works. By the way, members of Parliament don't serve for a one-year term. They serve for a 7-year term or 14 years. And typically they're not from the town. In fact, it hurts if they are. Your member of Parliament, and we don't call him a representative, is a member. He is part of Parliament. And he thinks about you only in the sense he's thinking about the empire as a whole. So imagine if your representative from Lincoln thinks about the interests of Massachusetts as a whole and comes back to your town meeting the next year and says, well, you know what, we wanted to get that new road, but it's actually much more important to improve the Port of Boston. That's really to the benefit of everyone in the province, much more so than our petty local interests. How would you respond? So it's a different thinking about what representation means. And if Parliament were to concede that, it would concede the whole grounds for having an empire. And just to be fair to Parliament, it had really only been since the early 1760s that Parliament had been thinking about governing an empire. Previously, it was thought colonies really were something outside our purview, and they're actually a drain on the mother country. After the 7 Years' War, Parliament realized that if we have an empire, we really should try to govern it. And that's really where the trouble begins. So short answer, I'm not really sure. Longer answer, I think that's a very good question. Are there others?
Others?
This gentleman back here.
What is the time lag between something that's decided in the States or in colonies and sent to England and get a response back, or vice versa?
That's very good. What's the time lag between something decided here, sent off to London, and gets back? So Quincy, just as an example, sailed from London end of September. He arrives in London early December. So you have about it can be longer. Typically, it takes about 6 weeks to get across. You can do it much shorter, depending on the wind and the current. The Gulf Stream helps get things faster from here to there than back. It can take about twice that to get something back. And then, of course, you have this time when they're making up their minds. You know, the British have a kind of a big bureaucracy with lots of different things to it. So there is a significant time lag. So it's in February of 1775 when Parliament decides, hey, what are we going to do about what we've heard has been happening over the winter? And they send, actually telling General Gage to get tough, but before that news arrived in early April, news arrives that actually William Pitt had been saying we really need to loosen up on the Americans. So it's unclear here in early April what the response will be, which is why the Continental Congress, which I mentioned, meets in, it adjourns in October of 1774, and they say, we will wait, we'll meet again next May, because by then we will have gotten an answer from the Crown. That is, they know how long it will take to send a message there, have someone read it, have to go through the various channels, and then get back. And it's fair to say, just as well, we always know that what is our interest is the interest of everyone. Parliament wasn't actually watching carefully what happened here. You know, Massachusetts, we here in Massachusetts know the world is always watching us and waiting to see what we do so they can follow. The world, at least in 1774, was not doing that, and Parliament had lots of other things on its mind than what was happening in North America. And if we were thinking about the empire in the 1770s in London, we wouldn't be thinking about Massachusetts at all. We would be thinking about Jamaica and Barbados, which really produced revenue for the Crown. More and more we'd be thinking about India. And it was the East India Company getting control of India that sets in motion the destruction of the tea. So Parliament has lots of other interests than us. Of course, our interest is the foremost one. But yeah, significant time lag. Takes about between 3 to 6 weeks to get a message there, and probably about 6 to 12 weeks to get a message back. Go back.
Do the members of the Governor's Council and assemblies who don't resign end up becoming loyalists by and large?
Do the members of the Governor's Council who don't resign wind up becoming loyalists? Yes. But I think becoming loyalists may be the wrong way to put it. They were loyalists. And everyone claimed to be loyal until they weren't. But yeah, they do. And most of them wind up fleeing into Boston, something you see happening after April 19th. A lot of people moving into Boston because they no longer can live in their towns, and vice versa, people trying to get out of Boston if they don't want to live under the occupation. The gentleman in the way back standing?
Sir, one gentleman you did not mention is the Reverend Jonathan Mayhew.
Yes.
How relevant was the spiritual component?
Well, that's interesting. Mayhew dies in the 1760s. I remember talking about Mayhew with actually a clergyman who pointed out that Mayhew wasn't really that well-known among others. Mayhew, in 1751, well, I have a whole lecture on Mayhew that I will spare you, but yeah. I'd like to know more about Reverend William Lawrence here in Lincoln. And apparently he was stopped from preaching because it wasn't clear which side he was on. The British regarded the clergy as kind of this other regiment who were inflaming people. And you do see a degree of this in many of the pulpits of Massachusetts. And Mayhew was one who may have coined the phrase about taxation and representation, taxation without representation being tyranny. We know that in 1751, when he hears that the Anglican clergy in Boston are going to observe the sainthood of King Charles I, who is a saint in the Anglican communion, having died for his faith against the Puritans, and he's inflamed by it. Many who is quite upset with this, gives a series of sermons about submission to authority and who sits in judgment on those in power. And his message is, you who are governed sit in judgment on those who govern you. And we know King Charles I couldn't be a saint, A, because Congregationalists don't believe in saints, but B, he was really a bad man, according to Reverend Mayhew. He probably wasn't a bad man. He was maybe not a good king, but that's a subject for another day. Yes, young lady in the back, yes, you.
Hi, is there something special in addition to religion, which I've always wondered if the Puritan faith, where, you know, your sense of power comes more internally and not from this sort of hierarchy through the Anglican communion, is that really the basis of why all this happens in Massachusetts and not all the colonies?
I believe it is.
Okay.
I believe it is that idea. A member of Parliament, and when they're debating why things are so crazy in Massachusetts, you know, everyone there thinks he or she is just as good as everyone else in their relationship with God. He says, I knocked on the door of a house in Boston. The servant answered, and I said, I've come to see your master. And this young woman said, I have no master but Jesus Christ. And members of Parliament thought that was hilarious because she's a servant, but she has no master except Jesus Christ. And that it's not an accident that the song that becomes essentially the marching song of the Continental Army is William Billings' song, Chester, that let tyrants shake their iron rod and slavery clank her galling chain. We fear them not, we trust in God. New England's God forever reigns. And that becomes the anthem for the Continental Army. And the good thing about it is a marching song, you can do it slowly or fast. But that's the thing for me. And you're absolutely right. But with that congregational idea also comes this idea of self-government. That is, the congregation is what determines what happens in the congregation as well as in the town. So you probably have more power over municipal government in Massachusetts than people have anywhere else in the British Empire. Remember, the British Empire considered itself the freest place in the world. So yes.
Thank you.
I think there was one more in the back, and then
Yes, this gentleman?
one more.
The times you were talking about, every one of the towns in Massachusetts had militia. What was the impetus for creating those militias?
I didn't hear what it was they had.
What I'm saying is that all of the towns in Massachusetts had militias.
Yes.
What was the impetus of
Oh, that's a good. Every town had a militia. Every man between the ages of 16 and 60 was a member of the town militia. And there would be different militia companies started by different people, but every man had to serve. And the impetus is defense against Native Americans, against the French, against the Spanish. So it is a defense force. And every town has a militia. They're also part of the county militia, which is why William Brattle is the general in charge of the Middlesex County militia. But then every town would have its own band. And depending on how big the town was, the officer might be a major or a colonel. In Barnstable, there are actually two, in early 1776, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress sends out a question to the towns of Massachusetts, knowing they're going to have town meetings. If a motion for independence should come up, how should we vote? This is really an extraordinary thing. Asking the towns how we should vote on independence. And every town vote says, yes, we would support that. In fact, they go further and then explain why. Barnstable is the only town that votes against it. And this is kind of embarrassing because James Otis Sr., of course, is the moderator of the town meeting. His son, James Otis Jr., is one of the leading, had been one of the leading lights of this. But what happens in Barnstable is this. There are two competing factions on the pro-independent side. Joseph Otis, another son of James Otis, and I'm blanking on the name of the tavern in Barnstable where the other family meets. I hope someone here will remember it before I'm done. And for a number of years, they ran a bed, there was a bed and breakfast, and they said, in this tavern, the Otises and the other family met to plan independence. And there actually is a beam overhead with saber marks. It's made by a red coat regiment that came to break up the meeting. Well, that's actually not how the saber marks were made. There's a fight. Joseph Otis is a commander of he's a captain in the militia. So is Seth Crocker. It's the Crocker Tavern. Thank you for reminding me. So Seth Crocker, also a captain in the militia. James Otis has gotten his guys together, got them uniforms, which is what you do when you want to be a militia officer. You know, John Hancock's unit, the 1st Corps of Cadets, had really fancy uniforms because he was well heeled. So, has anyone been in the military? Okay, a few people have. Even if you don't like an officer, do you have to salute? Yes. So some of the guys on the Otis side don't salute Seth Crocker because they say, well, he's not our captain. The Crocker side say, you have to salute him because he's a captain of the militia. They say, no, we don't. But the militia training day is one day a year when all the guys have to get together, show that they can fire their weapons, they do a little marching, they elect their officers, and then they get drunk. You know, there hadn't been a war for about 12 years at this point. And so the Crockers and the Otises get together on militia training day, and this is what happens. And some of the Crockers and the Otises don't properly respect the other officer, and a brawl breaks out. And Seth Crocker, trying to get away from the Otises, runs into his tavern, pursued by the Otises who are brandishing their swords, and they whack the beam of the Crocker Tavern. Now, at the next town meeting is when they get this resolution about independence. And their town has a leading loyalist who says, what's going to happen if we don't have the influence of the crown here? You're going to have the Crockers and the Otises trying to kill each other. Is that what you want? And that, in many ways, is democracy, right? We have big arguments about things and who resolves them, and they say, no, we don't want that, so they vote against independence. This becomes kind of an issue. And it's one of the reasons, getting back to your first question, how do the British miscalculate? They think it is impossible. Think about the differences in one town in Massachusetts, and then in all of the towns in Massachusetts, and then between Massachusetts and every other colony. Will these people ever be able to live together without wanting to kill each other? Sir Henry Clinton, who becomes the commander of British forces, said, what we should simply do is pull all of our forces to Canada and Florida, let them fight it out for about 10 years, and they'll get tired of killing each other and will ask us to come back. So the thinking is, they'll never be able to work together. So it's not simply their stupidity, so much as their awareness of our ability to fight one another. So thank you.
Professor Allison has many wonderful books, and one of them, if you want a short crib, is the short history of the American Revolution, and it is short. I'll warn you, the print is very small. It's on the bottom of that little book. But no, so I would urge you to go on the web and Google Professor Allison, and you will find access to both lectures, more lectures, and his books. And also, at the back of the room are the Lincoln Historical Society books and more information about Lincoln 250. And grab some cookies and things on your way out, and maybe some drinks. And thank you all for coming, and stay tuned for more.